Okay, Rolando, it's all yours.
Thank you, Genia. Welcome everyone to this presentation. Today with Sherif O, the translator with the Arabic Translation Service. He has been a presenter in the past and a frequent visitor at the DDLS. Besides being a translator, Sherif is a computational lexicographer, and his area of expertise includes terminology at the UN, as well as English, language and literature, and Arabic and Islamic studies. He has a master in translation studies too, and he has even published a couple of books on these topics. Today's presentation, as you know, is about terminology. Um, this is a conversation, not a policy setting exercise. We have very detailed guidelines and a long experience and expertise in this area at the UN. The goal of Sherry's presentation today, what's in a term, is to foster a conversation to stimulate thinking around these issues. And maybe what we discuss today here can be valuable as a reference, but also as a motivation to keep researching this very broad field. Um, Sherif is going to be talking particularly about what he sees as the three steps in this work. Um, the construction of a term and a terminological database, and the finding of equivalence and the management of the terms once we have those terms in a term base. I want to pass the floor now to Cecilia, the director of our documentation division, who would like to say a few words. Thanks again. My apologies for doing this from the phone. I have had technical issues with my laptop today, and I apologize for these glitches at the start of this presentation. You might think that we don't do it, but we run a test sometimes even twice before each presentation, but things happen. Thank you. Cecilia?
Thank you, Rolando. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I would like to start by thanking Sherif for proposing this presentation, which most certainly will elicit quite a lot of discussions because terminology is an area that all of us as translators and other language professionals, because I see that there are also interpreters or writing reporters in the video conference, we are all very, very interested. So during the past couple of years, actually, we have made quite a lot of progress in terms of fixing UN term, and we are in the process of continuing this discussion. So I just would like to start by saying that now we have a global terminological system, that it is very well maintained, that it is actually fed with the collaboration of all translators. We are having a new approach to terminology, which I think it is much more productive, where all of us are terminology experts. So conversations like the one that Sherif is going to present today and facilitate today after his presentation are actually extremely important for us because in terminology, since it is such an area of great interest for all of us, we may, put either too much effort or intention, and we need to balance also against what actually it is really, really, really useful in official terminology in our profession. So I just wanted to introduce this presentation and to signal the importance of terminology in our work, and to also tell you that Francis Enriquez, who is our UN term coordinator from the substantive side, and Natalia Bondono, who is the project manager of GText, who is actually in charge of the evolution of the UN term. And myself, I am the chair of the Terminology Board, which is a board with the participation of Michelle Keating and Ahed from UNOV. From the directors from UNOV and UNOG. We're all of us very committed to make terminology extremely useful for all language professionals. Also, just to finalize my introduction, UN Term is one of the stories that we are sharing with the member states as success stories and projects that we want to keep improving in the future, and it was displayed prominently in the section in the section 2 of the regular budget in the subprogram 3, which is our subprogram in New York. And I encourage you all to read there because you will see what we will try to do. So I guess that this is just the first conversation of series of conversations about terminology where we can discuss, brainstorm, and I mean, as I said, it's not like a policy setting forum, but it is like an extremely engaging opportunity to discuss about something that concerns us all. So thank you very much, Sherif, and the floor is yours.
Indeed, I would like to thank you, Cecilia, for this introduction. Actually, I'm overwhelmed by feelings of honor and gratitude that the stakeholders of terminology and translation in the UN, starting from Cecilia, our director and head of the terminology board, as far as I know, right? You are the president of the terminology board, and also Francis and Natalia. I hope she's here too. It's really a great honor for me and a pleasure to present this very modest presentation to you, and also to all my colleagues who are now present. I hope that this will be useful. Actually, it's just a way to start the discussion about terminology. I'm not claiming that I'm giving you any science. It's just some reflections I have accumulated through the years, through my work with terminology as a translator, not as a terminologist, because during the presentation, you'll see that I coined a term, which is the translator as terminologist. So because we are, as translators, we are required to contribute to terminology work. So while we are translating, we are also adding to the terminology database. So I think this presentation is targeted both for terminologists and for translators as terminologists, and of course to all staff who are concerned with terminology, like interpreters or and verbatim reporters. So thank you so much. You have obliged me with this magnanimous introduction. And now allow me to start sharing my stuff. Just I would like to give me you 50 seconds. I will adjust something with the settings. Just 50 seconds. I'll be back.
Sharif? Well, apparently Sharif is having some technical issues.
Maybe he's mute. I mean, or not. No, he's not mute.
I'm so sorry about that. So sorry. Actually, I would like to talk about three levels of terminology work, which are terminology construction, or you can call it creation, equivalation, and management. First, we need to define our concepts. The basic concepts we are talking about are the term, and the concept of terminology itself. So simply defined, a term is a word or a string of words used to label a concept in a specialized field. So you have two windows, the one at the left-hand side and the one at the right-hand side. So which of them is actually a term? So I think you would say that the one at the right-hand side, because it is a technical term. But maybe someone would say that the window at the left-hand side is also a term for those working with construction industry. So it's all something relative at the end of the day. Terminology can be defined as a systematic arrangement of concepts within a special field. But oops, there is a primary level which I omitted to mention. Can you guess what is it? I will tell you. It is what I call term recognition. Term recognition is a process whereby we figure out that a certain word or string of words is a term, and therefore decide to add it to our terminology database. You are capable to see the slides, right? Can you see the slides?
Yes, we can see everything. I know it's a little disorienting to be a presenter in this context. We can see everything. Thank you.
Yeah.
Continue.
Great. So, as if I am a translator as terminologist, or even a terminologist per se, on what basis do I stop and say, oh, this is a term that I must add to the term base, that I must suggest to the terminologist to add to the term base? For if we consider every word or expression we encounter as a term, then we'll end up talking about a lexicon, not a term base. But here in the UN, for practical considerations, we include terms and lexical items in our term base. So a term in our context could be a fixed expression, an idiom, a specialized single noun or compound noun encapsulating a concept. But there should be a limit, there should be criteria at the same time. So there are monolingual criteria and bilingual criteria for term recognition. The monolingual criterion means that the string is considered as a term in the source language, regardless of whether or not the translator has a difficulty understanding or translating it. So this is a criterion used by the monolingual terminologist. In our case, the English terminologist. So, for example, if I have a term like natural resources, this is an economic term. But the fact that it is a term is of little significance to translators, since it is both transparent and has direct equivalent in all the target languages translate to. Transparent means we can detect the meaning from the individual words. So translators may not even stop at it and say that it is a term, I need to add it if it's missing, because the strings are clear. So this is a monolingual issue. And of course, it is the incumbent duty of the monolingual terminologist to add it to the database. And we have it already in UNITER. Now we move to the bilingual criteria for term recognition that concern us as translators when we contribute to the terminology work. So this is what I call translation-driven or translation-induced criteria for term recognition. There is a unidirectional criterion and a bidirectional criterion. The unidirectional criterion has two sides, source and target. There is a source direction and a target direction. The source language induced, now I am in the bilingual mode. The bilingual sub-mode of this is source language. It means that the term is not transparent, though it has a direct equivalent. For example, I'll give you an example from this term I came across a long time ago. Market gardening. It's the business of growing fruit and vegetables on a commercial scale. To some extent, it's not transparent because we cannot tell what's market gardening from just this. We need to search. But it has direct equivalent in French, for example, culture maraîchère, if I pronounce correctly. Then we move to the other direction, the target language oriented direction. Here the term is transparent, meaning you can detect the meaning from the strings, from the words, but it has no direct equivalent. So in this case, and this is a very common case, the term is actually does not correspond to the standard definition of terminology, but for practical considerations related to the target language, we suggest it as a term. For example, the word, the term training consultant. Actually, if you go by the book, it's not a term, but since, for example, in Arabic, when we translate it, we paraphrase it as an advisory expert in the field of training. So this solution, me as a translator, I need to store it somewhere in order to be able to retrieve it again, because I don't want to think up this phraseology again in Arabic again and again. So it would be better if it is considered as a term and added to the database, and then to store this solution, this target language solution with it. Now we have the third criterion, which is the full-fledged term, bidirectional criterion. The term is both opaque and has no direct equivalent. Opaque means that you cannot tell its meaning from the words. It's like an idiom. And at the same time, it has no direct equivalent. So here, like what? Like this term, confinement leave, for example. You cannot detect the meaning of confinement leave from the words. It's a type of maternity leave which is offered in some countries. As you can see in Chinese, it is translated as maternity leave. In Arabic, we give it the idiomatic translation, delivery leave. This is the literal translation of it. So in this case, the two criteria are satisfied, and it is a must that the translator should suggest adding it to the database. Then I move to the second level, which is terminology construction. It's the creation of the terminological entry and annotating it with accurate information that facilitates the processing and accurate equivalent in the target language. So there are several types of data that has to be annotated with the term. We have conceptual data, linguistic data, metalinguistic data, and contextualized data. The major thing with conceptual data is definition, because it presents a clear explanation of the meaning of the term. If we don't have a definition with necessary and sufficient features, we will not be able to produce an accurate translation or equivalent. For example, the term auditing, which we don't have a definition in our UN term, for example, for auditing. And in my opinion, this is why sometimes the difference between auditing, the general meaning of auditing as oversight, and the accounting meaning of auditing as revising the accounting books are sometimes blurred because we don't have a clear-cut definition. I had discussion with Rolando before that, and Rolando says it is only accounting sense. But I think there is a shade of difference between the two. And when you are translating from English to a language like Arabic and Chinese, this difference will actually be more clear than when you translate to other European languages because of the effect of cognates in these languages. You may notice the difference, but in Arabic, we notice it. And perhaps in the Chinese too, I don't know, we can, our Chinese colleagues can talk better about this. Then we have the concept mode. It means specifying the type of concept. And this is very important. We have several types of concepts: entity concepts, domain concept, action, state, attribute, process, act, event. And confusing them can lead to wrong equivalence. For example, like competition and competitiveness. Competition is an act concept, while competitiveness is an attribute concept. So if we fail to see this, we will produce wrong equivalence. Then we have the linguistic data, grammatical category, gender, number, polarization. These are also are important data. Then we can move about to talk about the metalinguistic data. The first is the term itself as head of the entry, and then term type. It can range from full term to acronym, short form. And term type is very important as it alerts us to the missing entries whose equivalents already exist. For example, the full entry could exist with full metadata and equivalent, while its corresponding acronym is missing, or sometimes the reverse is the case. The acronym has an entry, while its corresponding spelled out entry is missing. So if we have a term type for each entry, it would be easy to retrieve missing entries and export them in a plain file. Contextual data. Contextualize examples that capture the real usage and the context where the term has previously been used. Now we move to the second level, which is term equivalation. It is a target language-based phase in the process. But at this point, we need to differentiate between term equivalation and the term translation. So I want you to just think it up if you'd like to guess, to speculate about the difference between because I didn't say I avoided using term translation, because here when you talk about terminology, it's different. Translation is not equivalation. And I would like you to guess, speculate about it for a second and tell me what do you think. What's the difference between term equivalation and term translation? Before I give you the answer, move to I give you some clues. Translation is basically about context, right? That's we all know. But what is the opposite of context? Can you tell me? Are you following Are you following me?
I'm just going to suggest that if anybody has an idea, they can raise their hand and we'll tell them to speak. Or you can just switch on your mic and answer Sherif's question. You have no takers, Sherif. You're going to have to give us the answer.
Okay, so okay, I have another question. What is but you can think of it until the end of the presentation. What is the opposite of context? I will ask you to think it up until the end. Okay, term equivalation means finding a target language context-free equivalent for the term as a lexical entry and not as a textual string. While term translation find a target language context-bound equivalent for the term in a specific text. But of course, there is a link between both, because term equivalation gives the input for term translation. And the opposite of context is content. So translation is about context. Terminology is about content because we analyze the internal conceptual content of the term. And also it is about context also, but in a different way than translation. It's of paramount importance, of course, for the terminologist not to be driven by a specific text, or he or she will risk producing an equivalent that covers the meaning of the term in that particular text only. Sometimes we, as UN translators, we can be driven by a single text if this text represents an authentic legal document in international law. In this case, we are bound by its legal force to use a term which has occurred only once. But this is an exceptional case. But in parliamentary documents and normal average documents, no single document should actually be the basis of our terminology decision, especially when there are other documents. We have to find them and to look at them and to compare. So there are some parameters suggested to under equivalation we can follow in order to solve these problems. These are coverage, substitutability, distribution, diversity, and consistency. Coverage means that the equivalent or equivalents should cover all or most of the occurrences of a given lexical unit, which is in actual practice is impossible, of course, but I will show you how to deal with this. As far as coverage is concerned, we have three types of equivalent: direct equivalent, indirect equivalent, and conceptual equivalent. Direct equivalence is a formal equivalent in the source term that represents a literal translation of it, but at the same time does not compromise the three criteria of accuracy, which are idiomaticity, adequacy, or we can call it accuracy, and comprehensibility. A very basic example is that of the term marketing efficiency, which is in most languages, I think, is translated in a straightforward manner. This is an example of direct equivalent. An indirect equivalent is a non-literal equivalent of the source term, to which we resort when a direct equivalent fails to satisfy the requirements of idiomaticity, accuracy, or comprehensibility. An example is the term algorithmic bias. It's, as you can see from the definition, a systematic and repeatable errors in computer that create unfair outcomes. You are biased towards a certain culture, certain group of people, so you change the algorithms to reflect your biases. When translated into a language like Arabic, if we translate it, give it a direct equivalent, it wouldn't be meaningful to the Arabic speaker. So we need to have a lexical conflation or a paraphrase, like you see, telling meaning prejudiced or biased redirection of electronic content. In Spanish, I found it like this, so you can help me with the pronunciation. But I'm not sure for Spanish readers whether it will make sense or not, because I assume that because there is it looks like a cognate algorithm and algorithmic might be, you know, but I'm not sure if it makes sense. A conceptual equivalent is an equivalent which conveys the propositional meaning, which is the basic meaning of the term, but may partially fail when considerations other than meaning come into play. For example, we have the term trafficking in persons. Suppose we have a sentence like, women are subject to trafficking in persons. the conceptual equivalent cannot be used here because the trafficking in person, the meaning of person is already implicit in the meaning of women. This takes us to another part, which is distribution. Here it is a process-oriented parameter for term equivalation. It refers to the frequency with which the translation of a given term occurs in a bilingual corpus, because when we are doing terminology work, we have to depend on a bilingual corpus like DT search in the past and now Illuna search. So we need to examine the frequency, the distribution of the translations in order to abstract a robust and an equivalent, a comprehensive equivalent, which can satisfy our needs. Now we can move to talk about substitutability. It means that the equivalent is fit to substitute for the source word in almost all its grammatical variations. For sometimes, an equivalent a term can have a different equivalent when it is singular than when it is uncountable. When it is countable, then it is uncountable. This happens a lot in some languages. For example, in Arabic, we have the term abortion. In Arabic, when it is countable, it means it is translated as an operation, abortion operation, or a case of abortion. So the terminologist has to take this into consideration, the bilingual terminologist, to provide two equivalents, one for the uncountable version and one for the countable version. Then we talk about diversity. It's a logical extension of the parameters elaborated. Since absolute coverage and absolute substitutability by single equivalent are impossible in many cases, so we need to provide diverse alternatives, diverse equivalence alternatives to fill in the equivalency gaps resulting from inadequate instrumentation of these parameters. As we have seen that in the case of a conceptual equivalent, we need to add other equivalent like trafficking in persons. We need to add also trafficking in order to avoid redundancy in some cases, like we have seen in the example I've just given. Sometimes there is a generic equivalent or conceptual one for the generic that's fit for generic texts, and some equivalent which is more specialized. A standard case of paradigm case is the term maternal mortality. For in some cases, general domain texts, it means death of mothers, and sometimes it could mean post-mortem deaths. In Arabic, we have two equivalents. One for the general domain, which is death of mothers, and one for a specific domain, which is in medical contexts, which is post-mortem death. Now there is an important also subparameter, which is consistency. Because without consistency, there is no conceptual coherence, both in the final texts or in the term base itself. We have three modes of consistency: internal consistency, external, and derivational consistency. Internal consistency means assigning the same equivalent to a term when it occurs in more than one terminological phrase with the same meaning. For example, The term factor is assigned different Arabic equivalents when it occurs in the terminological phrases mission factor and extreme environmental condition factor in peacekeeping mission texts. So when you imagine that you have a text that has a heading, a section about mission factors, and you translate factor as a coefficient. And under the heading, you have the term extreme environmental condition factor, and you render factor in a different way as not as coefficient, as a factor. The reader will think that these are two different things you're talking about, while actually it's the same thing. So such type of internal consistency in the term base has to be taken into consideration. External consistency means consistency of a terminological equivalent with term translations in previous documents related to the same field or subject, because our UN documents are continuous conversations between member states. So if different terminology are used, then the conversation will seem incoherent and disconnected, because sometimes you find that the actual texts or documents have translation of terminology, while in the term base we have different equivalents. So sometimes we get confused which one to use. Do we have to resort to the term base, or we have to use the previous documents? And it takes us a lot of time to settle to settle this confusing matter. Then I talk about derivational consistency. It means taking into account other derivatives that share the same root with the term in question to avoid conceptual incoherence when these derivatives occur with the term in the same context. I'll give you an example of the term recognition in the accounting sense, the accounting register. Sometimes it can occur with co-occur with recognize and recognizable. As you can see, we have recognition in French. We have 3 equivalents. In Spanish, we have like 4. In Russian, we have 1. In Chinese, we have 1. So, for example, if we have a text chunk like this, revenue is also recognized at the same amount as the asset expense, except to the extent that liability is also recognized. In French, we have 2 terms, comptabiliser and constater. I think that, and our French colleagues, if someone is present, can correct me, comptabiliser is more technical than constater. But suppose that we have the noun recognition, the noun which is comptabilisation and constatation at the same time. So the reader might not be able to connect, to know which is actually that this refers to this, unless they are absolute synonyms. And here we can talk about synonymy also as the role of synonymy. Really, if we want to talk about synonymy in terminology, we need actually to dedicate a whole workshop for it, because synonymy sometimes can be can help a lot, and sometimes it is very dangerous if it is not used, if they are not used with caution. The last station in my tour is term management, which is the process whereby terminological entries and their equivalents are stored, retrieved, and integrated with the translation memory. Each term type, synonym, and variant should be stored separately as new entries to increase retrievability and avoid burying terms within entries. Because this can have a marked impact on the scope of automatic searches performed by the translation memory tool. Sometimes quasi-synonyms are grouped in one card in the term base and assigned the same equivalent, while in fact they should not be treated as absolute synonyms in translation. I know that this problem has been solved to a great extent in the UN term, because now we don't have duplicates as we had in the past. It has been split. But I'm just telling you from my own observations in the past. An example is the term protocol and liaison service, which exists in UNHQ in the same card as protocol office, and they are assigned the same equivalent. While protocol office is split as a separate entry in the same term base and assigned a different equivalent. Like you can see, we have protocol and liaison service and protocol office, which are grouped in the same card, and here they are also protocol office is separated and is assigned a different equivalent. This could be also confusing. Integration with the translation memory. In all translation memory systems, when the translator prepares the resources for a translation, the relevant lists are selected. And this means that if a source term appears in more than one list with a different target term, the alternative that belongs to the list with the highest preference level will be suggested to the translator. The systems allow the user to set a priority list in which the selected terminology lists are assigned a preferential order. In our case, in Luna, the lists are the term basis. So we need a priority list which assigns a preferential order to term equivalents with UNHQ as the top priority, as far as I understand. But Zinia told me before the presentation that we have other priorities, like sometimes we need UNOG as a priority. She can talk better than me about this. And I don't know how we can actually solve this problem. This is a very specialized technical issue. And that's the end of it. And I feel that I have been boring. And I hope I didn't waste your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sherif. If you would unshare your slides,
Yeah.
we can open the floor to comments or questions and see what the participants would like to contribute to this conversation about etymology. Terminology. And I was going to ask if you're speaking to switch on your camera if you can. Yes, let's have you raise your hands just to have an idea of how many people would like to speak.
Okay, now I should turn off the camera, right?
No, keep yours on. It's fine.
Okay.
Okay, we have a couple of questions. I'll start with Dalia.
Okay.
Dalia, please go ahead.
Hi, Sherif. Thank you for the presentation. I have actually two questions. The first is about the priority and how exactly is it going to be assigned? I mean, does it automatically give priority to UNHQ because as far as I understand, every duty station has specific topics for the specific organizations that they have, and so for us here in Vienna, I would want to see the priority given to the equivalents from the field that I'm working in, because it could have another equivalent in other duty stations depending on their subject matter. The other thing is more or less related. So what happens if there's one term that has different meanings in different fields? Does it come under one title and then you have the equivalents for each field, or is it repeated per field? So each field would be an independent entry or record. Thank you.
Thank you, Dalia. Actually, concerning the priority, for my part, we in ATS, for example, we prefer use UNHQ, and but we don't set this. We cannot. This is not set as a priority in our Iluna version. We cannot. We have no control over that. And I'm just proposing. I'm giving the problem, but I don't have the solution. I wish there is a priority, because as a translator, I would, for example, need to go to directly to the equivalent which is most relevant. Sometimes when I found Iluna gives me a hyperlink to an equivalent which is very, very remote and very rare, while actually if there is a priority listing like other translation memory tools, that would make life easier for translators. But how this can be done and achieved, actually, I don't have the answer. So maybe our specialized colleagues would like to answer this. I think Natalia is raising her hand.
In
Yes.
fact, okay,
Thank you.
go ahead. And after Natalia, I have Francis and Hussein.
So actually, yes, there is prioritization of the databases, and each duty station and each language, target language, has the possibility of prioritizing the databases. And this is precisely for the reason that Dalia mentioned. If you are in UNOG, you will want to see probably UNOG records first. So it's not a setting at the user level. It's a setting managed at the focal point level. So I would encourage everyone who is more interested in this to reach out to their focal points so they can see what are the priorities that have been set for their respective target language, because they are, in general, they are discussed with the chiefs as well. So this is something that you can find more about with your focal point. Thank you.
Concerning the second question, actually, this is a very valid question that sometimes there are terms that have different meanings in different registers. Here in the UN, from my previous discussions about this problem with the stakeholders of terminology, they prefer that to avoid ambiguity and multiple sense, because it causes problems for them in the database, because they need to have a term with one meaning. But in actual practice, we don't have that. Sometimes we have multiple meanings for the same term. And I think that it is, in this case, it is, sometimes it is a split. I see some splitting. Sometimes it is on the same card without splitting. And these are just random observations. Maybe I am wrong. You can also, Natalia can answer to this if she would like.
I'm going to give the floor to Frances, who's had her hand up for a while.
Yeah.
Frances, go ahead.
Thank you, Zhenya. Hi, Sherif. Thank you for giving this presentation. So just a couple of comments and also to address Dalia's questions. We stick as much as possible to the one concept, one record principle, so that if you are talking about the same word used in different domains and they mean different things and they're translated differently in the other languages, we will have separate records for them. So when you look at the record and you see the domain, the subject, and you see that it's relevant to the document that you're translating, then you know that you're in the right place. So that's one thing. Regarding the issue of trusting one data set over another, when you're in UNOG and you want to trust UNOG records more, that is kind of the old approach when we still had fragmented data sets. As Cecilia mentioned earlier, we are approaching this idea of a global UN term, so that if you are looking at a record in the field of health, for example, if you're working in New York and you're looking at the UNOG record in the subject of health, and because it's their expertise, their field of expertise, it's something that you should trust. So it's a trust issue, I think. That's why translators and other language professionals are pushing for this prioritization of data sets. But as we consolidate our data sets and we engage in collaboration with the other duty stations, and we have this the distribution of labor in place depending on the field of expertise, we'll see less and less of this reliance on prioritization. Thank you.
I think we have a pragmatic solution for this when we have the feature of missing equivalent, which a translator, if he or she finds that there is a missing sense in the source language, they can, and there is no split entry for this sense, they can compensate for that by suggesting an equivalent in the target language, and this solves the problem for them. It does not, of course, solve the problem for all the languages. It solves the problem for only one language. But if the terminologist can find that there is a missing equivalent for one language, this means this clicks a nerve. It means that also there could be missing equivalents for other languages, and they can ask the bilingual terminologists in the other 6 languages to add them. And maybe you can also modify the metadata and the definition. We have a scope for this without necessarily having to split the entry. That could be a solution, in my opinion.
I have a Hussein next on the list. If you're still with us. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Thanks, Sherif, so much for the very informative and interesting presentation. Very nice work, really, and thank you for initiating this discussion about this kind of framework for term recognition. I'm very interested in this. You know, in Arabic we have had so many discussions about this, and there's still many things that need to be done about it. But I have a question that is like very specific to like your framework of how to recognize terms. Yeah. Mainly, most of the things that I have noticed in the examples were nouns. Like all the terms are headed by a noun. So I was wondering if this kind of framework would be also applicable to things like verbs or adjectives. For example, in like domain-specific verbs like to debug or to profile or things like that, or something like an adjective like semantic or syntactic or something like this. Does this framework or this approach accommodate things like this so that we can have more of standardized ways of expressing terms or expressing things that are not actually nouns but are more of like adjective or verb or even adverb types? Thank you.
Thank you, Hussein, for the question. This is a good question, and I will answer it to the best of my knowledge. Uh, uh, in a term base, actually, most of the entries are nouns because nouns are considered the best encapsulations of a concept because they are not they are very detached conceptually and neutral, and they are not time bound or bound by time and place. This is why in all terminology databases, most of the entries, if not all, are nouns, and like in our database too. Of course, we can add verbs and adjectives, but in this case, we are not in the terminology-based mode. We are in a lexicon mode. We are creating a lexicon. And of course, this decision depends on many factors. First thing is, do we actually need this? And whether it will be, does it pose any technological problems in integration with Eluna? Because if you talk about verbs, you talk about inflections, you talk about agreement, if you talk about adjectives, you're gonna enter into problems in the integration with the translation memory. These problems, I don't know to what extent they can be solved or not, because it needs a deeper level of computational linguistics. I'm not sure, and I'm not sure if we actually need to have such type of lexicon. But you can think it up and make us a presentation about that in the future. Why not? I will personally be most appreciative of this. Thank you for the question so much.
I see a comment from Hayam, and I was just wondering if you'd like to make the comment yourself to everyone.
Yeah, a comment here in the conversation.
Yeah.
I really don't know why I can't see the conversation. It's here. Yeah, I see the conversation is.
So Hayam writes, I think adding different forms other than nouns would not fit into glossaries or terminology. I think those forms could be searched on Eluna from already made translations.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, because they are. We can search them from Eluna because it takes you to the Eluna corpus, to the corpus itself, to the our UN corpus, which is, we called it data search before. Now it is Eluna search. That's correct, of course.
And I have I see Manuel's hand is up. Would you like to make a comment?
Yes, thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Sherif, for your presentation. This is Manuel from the Spanish Translation Service. I found it very interesting, and I thought while I was listening to you, that your presentation addresses a fundamental question, I think, in the area of terminology, which is the criteria that we want to use in order to decide whether to include a specific term in the database or not. I remember once in one of our talks in the service that I raised the point that and this was the question, do we want to include a lot of common words in the terminology, or do we want the terminology to be just a specific set of terms related to United Nations activities or United Nations entities, things like that? Because the more you expand the database to include common words, the more contextualized is the need for contextualized translations arises in the sense that, for example, if you have a common word like audit is a common word. Yeah. If you look at audit in the dictionary, you'll see that it has the accounting meaning, but it also has the more general meaning of examining carefully something.
Exactly.
And I've seen both uses of the word in United Nations documents. On the other hand, if you want to restrict the terminology to something more specific, you need to ask yourself the question, do I want just something like, say, a concept like peacekeeper, that related to United Nations activities, or something like humanitarian action, and we can decide to include that in the database. But the more you go into the area of general language, including all kinds of common words, whether they're adjectives or nouns or whatever, you're entering an area in which the database runs the risk of becoming just a regular dictionary, you know, and it will have more and more definitions for just one term, because this particular word, audit is one case, but there's other words that have even more meanings, would cause the database to have to include a lot of different definitions for each contextualized meaning of that word.
Yeah.
I was actually smiling when you used the first your first example, business gardening. And then it occurred to me, it came to my mind this expression in English called garden variety. Garden variety is a kind of funny expression because it's made up of two nouns.
Yeah.
But the fact is that the meaning is an adjective. It means commonplace or ordinary.
Yeah.
Should that be included in our database?
That's right.
Something like that. And it's not easy to translate because if you put the two words together in your own language, it makes no sense.
Yeah. Yes.
And
Exactly.
so these are the issues that we need to actually ask ourselves, I think. What criteria do we want to use to decide what terms would be included in our UN term database? I think this is the fundamental question.
Yeah.
Do we want a lot of common words, or do we just want a specific set of terms that are very narrowly linked to United Nations entities or activities?
Thank you, Manuel. And Sherif, before you respond, I just thought we'd also let Francis weigh in on this discussion.
Okay.
Francis? You're muted.
Sorry. Thanks, Zhenya. So to comment on that, we do have criteria already in place. They are found in the terminology guidelines that we came up with and that were recently approved by the terminology board. And so we allow very specific terms in UN term. We allow UN specific nomenclature, technical terms, names, which make their way into the names data set, and in very limited instances, phraseology. But these are very limited. These are exceptions. We don't normally allow common words that belong to the general language and don't require standardization. And so it's useful for terminology focal points to keep these criteria in mind, but it's also useful for translators and other language professionals when they make their suggestions so that nobody wastes their time, right? But yes, we don't normally allow common words because you can imagine how much everybody's work would get bogged down just trying to sift through these, and the dictionary is there already. You know, that's what it's there for. Thank you.
I see no other hands, so Sherif, please go ahead.
Yeah, I would like to comment on our two colleagues, Manuel's and Francis' answer to him. Actually, I think we need both. We need both the so-called common words and the terminology, but at the same time, we need to take into account the limitations we have, that we don't need to create new entries, as far as I understand from France. So the compromise is when we have a definition, a good definition, which can cover all the aspects of the concept as far as possible, it will allow us to produce equivalents, as many equivalents as can cover everything. Because in actual practice, for example, when you talk about auditing, we in the UN documents, sometimes we talk about auditing in the strict accounting technical sense, and sometimes the documents refer to auditing simply as oversight or revision or examining something, as Manuel said. So we need to have both. We need to be more flexible, but at the same time, we also take into account the guidelines Francis is talking about regarding the the size of the data, the size of the entries, because we don't end up creating an encyclopedic dictionary or for them. So, in my opinion, the solution is to expand on the equivalents rather than expand on the source language entries. And concerning the criteria, when I was talking about criteria, I didn't mean I am aware of the guidelines and the criteria that you have in the terminology guidelines, but I'm talking about the criteria as cognitive process. As a cognitive process, how we as translators as terminologists think while when we suggest a new term. I'm introspecting, just introspecting. I'm talking about how I myself do. Maybe you can share me the same thoughts. So I'm putting myself in the shoes of all translators and myself as a translator, and try to figure out the what criteria I myself use to decide, oh, I send this term to the terminologist to edit. So that's what I want to clarify concerning the criteria. I hope I answered the question. And I would like to also add something related to technology and to terminology. It's really good news for us that because most of us are concerned that the huge advances of machine translation and neural machine translation will end up actually making translators redundant. But actually, this could be a possibility on the long term, but not for terminologists. Terminologists will still retain their job forever. Why is that? Because, as I said, translation is all about context. The computer, whether all machine translation systems, rule-based, statistical, hybrid, or neural, depend on context. They don't get inside the concept, the term itself. They just work contextually. They gather contextual data and perform operations, huge statistical operations. So I compare it to like you say, suppose that you have a necklace made of hazelnuts. What the machine translation system does, it connects the hazelnuts with each other to make this necklace, but it does not crack each hazelnut and look inside it and they get any result, because that's looking inside the hazelnut is the work of the terminologist. It is about content. So, and you can try this yourself. Just look at the terminology. If there is no, for any neural machine, look at Google Translate, at the current Luna neural Translate. If you don't have the term already in the database, that it will never get you, it will not be able to coin a term in the target language. And I can raise a bet on that. You can, and I'll pay you whatever you want if you find a single term that neural machine translation can coin in any target language, because it cannot. It only uses the equivalents that are provided, but it will not be able to produce an equivalent because it cannot crack the nut. I hope it makes sense.
Sherif, I have two comments. One of them is that I think in some ways the perspective coming from the English into English translation might be a little bit different. I have been spot checking a document I'm working on right now, and the situation has much improved, but for a long time the terminology panel in Iluna was showing us too many completely inappropriate terms in the context of the text that we were working with, precisely because too many general terms had been added to the terminology database. And Francis might remember that I was a very proactive submitter of reporting terms as noise. Of course, noise from our perspective, because what we were seeing is, with the example you gave in your presentation, one term in English and a long list of potential equivalents in the other languages. So we were getting that English term suggested to us for all of those source language terms, or maybe they weren't even terms in the context in which we were seeing them. So that's one experience I personally have had with the UN term and with how it integrates with Iluna. And the other was not so much of a comment, but I know there's probably some interpreters in attendance today, and I think it would be very interesting to hear their take on terminology and how they approach how this decision-making process. How do you decide whether to include something in your glossary or not, and also the extent to which you make use of UN term in your work. So I don't know if there are any interpreters who would like to make any comments on this. Moving right along. Oh wait, there's a comment in the chat, perhaps. Oh, and Nina, yes. Anyway, that was just an attempt to open the floor for interpreters who might want to share their perspective on terminology. Other than that, I don't think I have anything more to add. Sherif, do you have any concluding comments, remarks?
Just I want to say that this is not everything I have about terminology. There are many other issues related to terminology concerning construction and equivalation, and we need to discuss and talk more deeply about this, and to also be guided by the limitations we have, because if we talk, ideally we will not be able to implement what we are talking about. So I think that we need to have more discussion about these issues, and I encourage our colleagues to think up other issues and to develop this framework if they find that they can start from it. I hope that we can work together to elaborate on it and to develop it and modify it, correct it, refine and revise, and so that we can have a better terminology database than we have now. Of course, I don't say that what we have now is bad. I think it's very good, but we can improve. We can wish for things much better. So
I want to give Hayam an opportunity to make a comment.
Good afternoon, everybody. I would like to thank you, Sherif, for this very valuable lecture. And from my position as an interpreter, as we were invited to comment on our experience with terminology. Currently, given the telecommuting circumstances, I am involved in a glossary team in my booth, and this made me actually get exposed to more and more of the eLuna search and the UN term. And what I noticed is that some terms are not really, well, in the booth, I found that some terms are missing. So there are some terms that I cannot find on UN term. Maybe if I search in eLuna, but given the time limit in the booth, it's very limited. I cannot search, and then the internet connection might not be the best, so I wouldn't be able to get it very fast from eLuna. In addition to the fact that with eLuna, we have a lot of choices. So, well, I need to read a whole paragraph to get to the term, especially in the Arabic. When we have the Arabic column, you don't have it highlighted in yellow. So you have the term highlighted in the English column, whereas in the Arabic, you need to read the whole paragraph to get to the term. And while making the glossaries, I found that there is some discrepancy between the documents that are translated into Arabic, especially when, it happened that I was working on the second committee documents and reports, which is which about macroeconomy and all these economic issues. I felt that some reports are translated by freelancers maybe, and some are translated by staff members, and I found a lot of discrepancy between the terms. And some of the terms were really like out of context. I felt that some of them were not really translated by somebody who was exposed to that before, whereas I found other documents that were with better translation. So is there any effort? I know that you are making a lot of effort. Is there any endeavor to unify especially that it's the same paragraph, like it's a report from 2018 and this is a report from 2019, more or less it's the same text, but with very different terminologies. And I'm not here talking about the stylistic differences, which is how every single translator might write, but some terms were really very different. Thank you.
Actually, Francis wants to say something. I think we should take her point.
Yes, thank you, Sherif.
Welcome.
So when there are missing entries, we encourage staff and other users to make suggestions, whether it's a missing equivalent, an incorrect equivalent. We encourage suggestions, and this is part of our new work of integrating terminology into whether it's translation or editing or revision. The fact that we are doing research and we come across some inaccuracies in UN term, we encourage everyone to report those and to suggest the correct version. Another thing is when you have glaring differences in terminology and it makes you wonder whether something was translated by an in-house translator or a freelance translator, Natalia and I do give training to contractors and freelancers. So whether you're in-house or working contractually, you should have access to the same terminology resources. So I really don't know whether it's a quality control issue, but in theory, anyone who's translating or working on a UN document would have access to the same records in UN. Thank you.
And just quickly, one more time, a comment from Manuel, and then I think we'll have to wrap it up considering the time. Go ahead.
Yes, I was listening to Francis as well, and I think the general criteria that she referred to earlier that are actually already being used, I think that goes in the right direction. I think UN terms should move away from becoming a general dictionary, avoid including a lot of common words that are very polysemic, that have many different meanings, because a terminologist runs the risk of missing one or two or three or more of them when including that term in the database. And only in as far as a common word has become a word that is used in the United Nations context with a very specific meaning, say something like demining, something like education grant. You want something in the database because you don't want the word grant to be translated in different ways by different languages, because it's all part of the same documents that, administrative documents that we all use in the United Nations. Those kinds of examples should be included and should be fixed by UN term. Otherwise, it needs to move away from the general dictionary area and become a very specific, very specialized, and very United Nations centered kind of knowledge base. That's my opinion. Thank you.
All right. I want to thank everybody for your comments, and Sherif for your presentation and for being in the hot seat for the last half an hour or so. And Rolando, would you like to say a few words? And also remind participants about this Friday.
Yes, I want to thank Sherif for his intellectual courage in making this presentation, because sometimes we forget that there is room for debate here at the UN in our language services. We have guidelines, we have set practices. Maybe some people think that we cannot talk about those guidelines, but nobody has ever said we can't. So I think this is a good example of things we can do to encourage conversation without every time we present a topic making people feel as if we were going to set a new policy. So in this respect, I repeat, I want to thank Sherif for his intellectual curiosity, which is boundless, and his intellectual courage, his honesty in bringing these topics to the light. I want to also thank Natalia, Francis, Manuel. I have had many conversations with Manuel about these topics informally, of course. We share a strong interest in these issues because terminology is at the core of what we do here. And many people, even though they don't say it, have opinions about terms on a daily basis. I want to also thank Hussein and other attendees, including some colleagues from outside of New York, from other duty stations. I want to thank Cecilia for having made it, even though she's always super busy. She makes an effort to attend as many presentations she can, and I appreciate that. I want to thank Eugenia and Selena for being an essential, indispensable part of this DDLS team. And I want to briefly announce that next Friday, we will have an activity, a very special activity to celebrate the Russian Language Day. It's gonna be conducted mainly in Russian, so everybody who knows some Russian, loves Russian, and particularly poetry is invited to come. We will have some high-ranking guests. I will keep it a secret. So I think this will be very special what we're going to do on Friday. Thank again everybody. I look forward to seeing most of you on Friday. Thank you.
And
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Just an idea, just unmute your microphone if you wish to give Sherif a round of applause.
Thank you so much, and thank you for tolerating me for almost 2 hours now. And I really appreciate that. And I hope that the conversation can continue for the sake of improving the backbone of our work, which is terminology. And thank you again for everything.
Thank you, Sherif.
Bye.
Thank you.